In smooth muscle, you need another enzyme called myosin phosphatase. All right, a phosphatase does the opposite of a kinase. It'll want to add phosphate to something. All right, and so that also takes time. So muscle relaxes slower than in skeletal muscle. Okay.
Well, enzymes typically break things down though.
Yes, but usually a phosphatase is going to remove, typically will either remove a phosphate or inactivate something. All right. Okay. All right. Now, all of these things contribute to smooth muscle acting kind of different, but smooth muscle cells also behave in another way, in that smooth muscle cells have to be stimulated individually. Okay? All right? So it's not like the axon terminal generates some sort of motor unit where you can have one axon and a bunch of muscle fibers. All right? Each one of those smooth muscles can act somewhat independently. And they can do so in one of two ways, depending on where that smooth muscle cell is located. Right? The first one is called single unit. And a single unit type of muscle contraction involves these individual smooth muscles linked together by gap junctions. What do gap junctions like to do?
Communication between cells.
Okay, that's pretty much in a nutshell. All right, so these individual smooth muscle cells have to be able to communicate with each other to contract collectively. Okay, now look at that neuron. It kind of looks a little funny. All right, we're used to seeing this axon terminates, and then you've got a bunch of neuromuscular junctions happening. Well, in this case, you've got these swellings called varicosities. All right, these swellings are loaded with neurotransmitter. All right, so a single unit is going to have this particular axon of a neuron releasing acetylcholine. Okay, so acetylcholine is going to stimulate those smooth muscles that are closest to the neuron. And so, how are you going to stimulate the rest of the smooth muscles? Those gap junctions allow for the acetylcholine that was in the first few smooth muscle cells to diffuse to the other smooth muscle cells via those gap junctions. All right. Good example is your digestive tract. All right, from the esophagus pretty much close to the rectum. All right, that's a lot of smooth muscle that has to push a lot of things down that way. All right, those smooth muscle cells are linked together by gap junctions. All right, that's a little bit different to a multi-unit type of setup. All right, there are no gap junctions. All right, they still have to be stimulated individually. And so in this case, the axons of these neurons themselves are going to be kind of moving through that little smooth muscle population. And so these swellings are going to be able to stimulate the smooth muscle. Okay? All right? And so what happens is you've got something, and pardon my French because I don't really know French very well, synapses en passant, meaning synapses in passing. You've got all of these varicosities or these swellings that are able to make synapses with a bunch of smooth muscle cells. So it acts as a multi-unit as opposed to a single unit. All right?
So single use kind of dominant effect.
Yeah. So you have to have the movement of that neurotransmitter to go through. All right? Any questions on smooth muscle? All right, your last slide of the day. I'm not even gonna start chapter 13, okay? Cardiac muscle cells is essentially a blend of both skeletal and smooth muscle, all right? How is it like skeletal muscle? It's striated. Those sarcomeres are sitting end to end, okay? All right, so that makes it kind of similar to skeletal. It's involuntary, so it's going to be like smooth muscle. Now, something unique about cardiac is that cardiac muscle cells will branch out, all right, and reach out and touch another cardiac cell. All right, so the cartoon does a better job. So here is a cardiac muscle cell. You see that striations as you do underneath the microscope, but then those cells branch, okay? And each branch can make contact with two different cardiac muscle cells, all right? And so what happens is you've got these darkened regions here, these dark lines, what are called intercalated discs that link those branches of the cardiac muscle cells together, okay? Within those links called intercalated discs have gap junctions. And as Carly said, gap junctions like to move things so that they can communicate with each other. And so what makes cardiac muscle unique, that these gap junctions allow cardiac muscle cells to be able to contract in unison. Where are you going to find cardiac muscle cells? In the heart. So the heart acts as an organ, as a pump, loaded with cardiac muscle cells. So in order to have this concerted contraction that spreads from one part of the heart to another, all right, you need to have this movement of ions that will allow for muscle contraction to take place. Our friends, sodium, potassium, and calcium as well, all right? So cardiac muscle is unique because it kind of acts as one big thing, all right, or as a single unit. Another thing about cardiac muscle is that it does not need nervous stimulation in order to contract, okay? It can produce action potentials on its own, okay? Now the nervous system can regulate, all right, through parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous stimulation. It can regulate how fast, how hard, how slow that heart is going to beat. But in order to actually have action potentials, it can do it on its own, okay? The action potentials, as you'll find out in the next chapter, also are a little bit different. We know our action potential kind of takes on this sort of conformation: depolarization, repolarization, hyperpolarization, all of that jazz. In cardiac muscle cells, you have depolarization, but then you sort of have this plateau, all right, before it repolarizes. So the action potential is longer, okay? It takes time for that action potential to go from start to finish, and it also will have a much longer refractory period, right? It still has absolute, it still has relative, but collectively they are longer than that of skeletal muscle. You don't want to have extra stimulation, all right? You want to keep that heartbeat going at a steady drum, all right? You don't want any of this, and you certainly don't want any of this, okay? All right, any questions on muscle? Not that bad.